This week on Quadriga, bloodshed in Egypt, no way out. Parts of Cairo and other Egyptian cities turned into battlegrounds on Wednesday as the Egyptian army moved in to clear protest camps set up by supporters of ousted President Mohamed Morsi. After warning the demonstrators to leave the camps, security forces backed by armoured cars and bulldozers moved in. The situation escalated quickly and the violence has now claimed a number of lives on both sides. The Muslim Brotherhood is calling the event a massacre. The army has declared a nationwide state of emergency. Can Egypt draw back from the brink of civil war? Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Is the Arab Spring definitively over? That's the question we want to pose today to three experts who've been following events in Egypt closely. And our guests are Ahmed Badawi. He is Egyptian. He's now co-executive director of Transform, a Berlin-based organization that specializes in conflict resolution. Throughout the 1990s, he reported from Egypt as a print and TV journalist. And Samir, he also is Egyptian. He's now living and working as a freelance journalist and media consultant here in Germany. And finally, Kuhlmann is a freelance journalist who specializes in events in the Arab world. He's reported from the Middle East for the DPA news agency, and he studied Arabic at the American University in Cairo. Well, welcome to all of you, and I'd like to start out by asking our two Egyptian guests what you're hearing from people back home. Ahmed Badawi?
People are confused, they're angry. Until late at night, the curfew, I think, is beginning to take some effect. Hopefully, things would be clearer today, whether there will be more violence or things would calm down a little bit. It's yet not clear, but it's very tense.
The government had said that it simply had no alternative. The camps had turned into self-sufficient colonies. They say the people within them were often armed. What are people in Egypt saying about those arguments?
People are divided. Some people believe these arguments, completely believe them, and they feel that the government should have actually moved in a lot sooner than what it did. They see the Muslim Brothers as a terrorist organization, and I'm surprised at how much people are angry at the Muslim Brothers. On the other hand, there are those who see that what happened was a coup. They are supporting the Muslim Brothers, and those who are not part of the Muslim Brothers but who support them, they support them because of their understanding of how democracy should be, and that what happened was something that is against democracy. So the country is extremely, deeply polarized.
Samir, does that sound like the feedback that you're also hearing from Egypt?
Yeah, I would say similar. I have some old friends and even family members who are part of the two sides. And some Salafists and Ikhwans, they are really determined to reach their goals, their political goals, even if it means that destroying a big part of governmental institutions or even buildings. And I have to say the people who are not politicized are not supporting Ikhwan, and they don't see what the military and security forces doing to be exaggeration of use of force. They believe that the threatening with using violence, what Islamists, including Ikhwan and their supporters did, is also a sort of terrorism. And I have to agree with them, because the claim that the Islamists, Ikhwan, Salafists, jihadists, Jamaat Islamiyya, they were all claiming that they are peaceful and their sit-ins and demonstrations don't have any arms, but it is a lie. There are arms, it's documented, and they know that peaceful demonstrations in Egypt at this moment would not bring any results. The only hope for them to get any political change is escalation.
Samir, just remind us, if you would, please, because, of course, many of our viewers are not in the Middle East, don't know events there in the detail that you do. What is one, or who is one?
Ikhwan, they are the Muslim brothers. This is the Arabic word,
Okay.
and this is actually, you'll find it in dictionaries, English dictionaries now. They are, Ikhwan are the Muslim brothers.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you very much for the clarification. Jan Kuhlmann, we do now have a state of emergency in place. We have seen the designated Vice President El Baradei saying that he is stepping down. He will not tolerate being a part of a government that uses violence. Is every pretense of a transition to democracy now gone, in your opinion?
At least I'm not very optimistic. I don't see Egypt moving towards democracy, and it's very interesting what we see right now. Actually, it's Egypt at the moment is turning into a new kind of military dictatorship. It might come that way that Egypt will see some kind of civil war if violence is not going to stop. And it's interesting to see that there's always the Muslim Brotherhood who's blamed for all the violence we see here in Egypt. I mean, of course, it's true that there were some groups, some radical groups among all the demonstrants who support Morsi, who have weapons. But in the end, it was the military who started all the violence. We had the incident in front of the headquarters of the Republican Guards in the beginning of July, where more than 50 people from the pro-Morsi camp were killed by the military. And even Amnesty International said it was the state security who killed all the people. And if you follow the independent press, like the New York Times, who talked to many people, you can see that it's the military, that it's the state security, that it's the Interior Ministry who brought Egypt to this escalation of violence, and that it's not the Muslim Brotherhood. And when we saw what happened in Turkey, everyone condemned Mr. Erdogan, but what the military now is doing in Egypt is much worse than what happened in Turkey, and now the Muslim Brotherhood is blamed for this escalation. Sorry, but this is really black and white.
Okay. I'd like to challenge what he said, that all those international organizations and media outlets confirmed that the military started the violence. What they said is the military used excessive force. And I agree that the military used excessive force. You cannot judge that the military started the violence. How
would you call snipers on the rooftops?
Yeah, they are.
Why are there so many people killed by live ammunition?
Is this a proof that they started the violence, or that they wanted to send a clear message to Islamists who are threatening with using violence that they will not tolerate any trials of attacking security forces? And they sent a very hard message. They were a use of excessive violence. I accept and I agree, and this is not democratic. This does not apply to the Western standard of human rights. But what's happening in Egypt now is exceptional, and I agree with you that Egypt may be on the way to a new dictatorship. And this is something the Muslim Brotherhood are using now as if they are democratic. They use democracy to get into power. But I ask you, do you think the rule of Morsi was democratic?
It was more democratic than with what we see now, and you're defending just the violence of the military.
I'm not defending it.
You're defending it. You're defending it. There have been at least more than 200 people from the Muslim Brotherhood killed. So I ask you, who is behind the escalation?
Ahmed Badawi, how armed is the Muslim Brotherhood? To what degree are they a potential for armed violence amounting to civil war? They have now called their supporters out onto the streets throughout the country. To what extent is that likely to turn into violence, and was there an alternative that would in fact have been peaceful?
Okay, let me answer these questions, and then I'd like to pick another friendly quarrel with Jan. They're armed, but I don't think they're armed to the extent that they would stand any chance in front of the Egyptian army. So that is one thing that is clear. There are documents, as Said said. I mean, we know that they are armed. But the use of force was so excessive. There were other options to deal with this sit-in in Rabaa. And the option, I think, that Baradei preferred was to let it sizzle out, to dry it from the source, as they say. So that is
And
one.
do you think that would have happened?
That
Would they at some point simply have gone away?
Over a period of time, over 1 month, 2 months, even 3 months. They could have just stayed there for 3 months. But that was the one part of your question, and the other part about civil war. I doubt that there will be a civil war like what we're seeing in Syria. But what we may see is something similar to what happened in Egypt in the 1990s. So radical jihadists would pick up, I think the Muslim Brothers are more or less finished as an organization for now. But that's another story. We'll get to that. It's a very complex organization. But there might be jihadis like what we've already started seeing, attacking churches, creating blood feuds in Upper Egypt, and this can have a dynamic of its own and can take us back to something like what we've seen in the 1990s, maybe. Now, my friendly quarrel with Jan is not about whether there was excessive use of force or we're going back to dictatorship or not. My issue is thinking about what is happening from the perspective of democracy or from the perspective of a transition to democracy is very misleading, is very, very problematic. The discourse of democracy and democratization and all that, first of all, it's very problematic to speak of democracy without defining it. And one of the big things that I really feel sorry about are those poor Islamists who were fed with the belief, the idea that democracy equals elections. That if you win an election, regardless of how you win it, by giving out oil and rice and meat to poor people so that they vote for you, so that winning a democracy, regardless of how you win it, winning an election is equivalent to democracy. And this is what is driving them now, what is motivating them to act. They think you promised us that if there are democratic elections and if there are free elections and we win, we will be able to rule. The problem is they could not have ruled. The organization, the Muslim Brothers, in the way it exists now, with its ideology, it's been living in secrecy for the last 60 years. It's now ruled by a very militant faction. They call it inside the organization the Qutbi faction. They came into direct clash, a direct contradiction with what the army believes to be Egypt's national security. We have to think of something. The army was so willing to give power to the Muslim Brothers. The Muslim Brothers, it was the only organization, the only political force in Egypt that could allow the army to maintain its privileges. So it was absolutely in the best interest of the army to have the Muslim Brothers as this facade, this large political organization to rule, and they can hide behind it. And
Let me just ask you for the bottom line here. Are you telling us that ultimately Egypt is not in a position to try to transition to democracy? Are you telling us there is no democratic path for Egypt as you describe it?
It depends on what you define by that. What do you mean by that? If you mean a democratic path that a country would change around after 60 years of dictatorship and become a democracy in 2 years, then the answer is no. It doesn't exist. This is a myth.
It's a process.
Saeed, Samir, it is a process.
Yeah.
Where does it need to go now? Where can it go now? What is the next step for your country?
There is a big difference between what I think is right path and what I expect.
Yeah, tell us both. Tell us what you think is feasible as the right path that's feasible and what you expect.
First, what I expect. What I expect is clear that the security forces or the state now is determined to get rid of the Muslim Brotherhood and some other Islamists, maybe apart, but not all Islamists, apart from a political party which is a Salafist party, and they are very pragmatic, Hizb al-Nur, the Nur party. And I think this is dangerous because this can drive so much violence in the long term, and they are creating terrorists this way. I think the state should be very careful dealing with the security issues and balancing it with giving some room to the Muslim Brotherhood and to other jihadists to take part in the political process, and this would be, this is what I expect, what I think is the right path. But the problem is people in the streets, they are furious about the Islamists. People have been pressuring the military to take the action and dissolve these sit-ins. And back to his question, and I still challenge his argument that the military started the escalation. If you want to investigate a crime, you search for who benefits from it. Escalation is not to the benefit of the state, but it is to the benefit of the Islamists, because they know it is the only way that they might have some hope to get a real political change.
Jan Kuhlmann certainly addressed that, but if you would please perhaps also the question of liberal Egyptian support for the military. It has been perhaps for some of us outside surprisingly strong, right up until the last minute, a sense among many liberal Egyptians that the Muslim Brotherhood must be crushed at all costs.
Yeah, that's what the military wants to do. It wants to crush the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist organizations. And the only force who's really benefiting from what is happening in Egypt is the military. They now have the state of emergency. They have a curfew. So it's back to the old Mubarak times. And it's interesting. It's also the old Mubarak-style arguments which we are hearing right now. And if you follow the state media in Egypt, you can see that there were claims like war on terror. This is just so obvious, and this is just so, I don't know. For me, it's a bit naive to think, just to blame, sorry to say so, but it's just naive just to think that the Muslim Brotherhood is behind all this and that they are the ones who are in charge of or who are to be blamed for the escalation. I mean, they have their part in the whole story, but the stronger part is the military, and for me, actually, there's no discussion about it.
This whole issue of who's to blame and who's not to blame, what we're trying to explain are dynamics that have nothing to do with democracy, that have nothing to do with the way politics are usually thought of in the West. This is a completely different context there, and we have to understand it in its own terms. What we're having in Egypt is a fight, an existential fight between two authoritarian forces.
And let me just finish what I wanted to say. I just wanted to repeat to the argument. The problem is that the military and other political forces in Egypt really want to crush the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is for sure. If they are not part of the political solution in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, and I'm not sure if they're really finished as organizations because they have a long history, they are very strong, they are big, they're everywhere in the society. So you can't get rid of them. They have to be part of the political solution if you want to have a peaceful solution, if you want to have something which gives the country more freedom. And I think that in the end, the liberal camp is pretty weak and they don't have any saying in what's going on right now.
Ahmed Badawi, to what extent have we gone back to the Mubarak time, as Jan Kuhlmann just talks to us, or to what extent does the Muslim Brotherhood now find itself actually in an entirely new position? The fact is, in Mubarak's time, they were allowed some sort of political outlets, whereas, as we've all been saying, at this point, it looks like the military government is out to crush them entirely. Is it a new situation for the Brotherhood, and how do you see its future?
The Muslim Brotherhood will have to change itself if it wants to have any future in Egypt. The dynamic in Egypt is as follows. Because we don't have the democratic method for solving conflict among the elite, what happens is if all political forces unite against a force, that force loses. What is happening in Egypt now is that all political forces in the country, and that's the military, the judiciary, all the institutions of the state, and all the other political forces had an interest in getting rid of the Muslim Brothers. The Muslim Brothers, in this context, they have no future.
That even includes Al-Azhar, the famous mosque that's the center of Islamic learning in Egypt.
This is precisely what happened before getting rid of Mubarak. We only got rid of Mubarak when everybody united against Mubarak. And this is the big problem in Egypt. People unite against something. What is needed now is to find a way to unite people for something. And this is the big challenge in Egypt now.
Do you see the seeds of that happening, Saeed Samir? Do you see any kernel from which that could grow?
I think it's still early to have a clear vision of what could happen in the next few months. I do believe that there were enough proposals, and the Muslim Brothers and their supporters, they had enough time to get to compromise. But the problem is they are believers, and their supporters, I talked to some, back to this, I talked to some supporters who are not direct members of Muslim Brothers, but they don't approve Morsi. They hate Morsi. But still, they are fighting their war because they dream of a new Islamic empire. Something is more like wishful thinking. They know it is not very realistic, but still, because they are believers. Morsi himself, in his speeches, he would say, I was chosen by God before the people. Such a statement tells us about how the ideology of this group, and I totally agree with him that they have to change this ideology. They have to play politics. They have to stop abusing religion. They are doing it. Their double standards go the whole way from inside, attracting their supporters by we are fighting a religious war. And for the outside world, they are claiming we are pro-democracy and we want to legitimacy of our president. This is not working. They have to be sincere. They have to regain the credibility of the people in the street, the unpoliticized people. They are the main factor here. And I think they have lost it. And for them to get back to the picture, they have to do a real rethinking of their ideology and to gain back the credibility of the street.
We talked about process. There was a process, at least ostensibly in place, Jan Kuhlmann, since the coup on July 3rd, and it was to have this transitional government and the military moving ahead with a plan that would include drafting a new constitution. Would you say that that is now on ice, a dead letter?
Well, it seems like this. We have to wait what's going to happen in the next days. Mohammed El-Baradei, who was a very important part of the whole so-called transitional process, he retreated, he stepped back yesterday, so I don't know if he still wants to take part in the process. So I'm very skeptical that this is leading to something except to some kind of new military dictatorship.
Ahmed Badawi, we tend to be very focused on Cairo, certainly in the last 48 hours as we've watched events there. Tell us something about what you see as what's happening in the countryside, because of course the Brotherhood has been very strong in the countryside. It did call on its supporters in the countryside to mobilize. And with the countryside, I would also include Sinai. We've seen a lot more unrest in the Sinai. How are those things connected, and where do you see that going?
First, very quickly about what's happening in the rest of Egypt. The most disturbing thing that I've heard is the attack on Coptic Christians. This is absolutely appalling. I'm not sure that this is the Muslim Brothers. But when we speak about Islamists, there are also very hardline Salafists who are probably doing these attacks. Regarding Sinai, I think that first of all, I'm not sure that the Islamists, that the military wanted to get rid of the Muslim Brothers. Because if we agree that the military had its interest with the Muslim Brothers, then what changed the military? And I think the answer is Sinai. The big problems started between Morsi and El-Sisi. Big part of it had to do with Sinai. The general who was heading the military government. Had to do with Sinai and had to do with Egypt's regional role. I have information that El-Sisi knew about Morsi's decision to cut diplomatic ties with Syria only 1 hour before this happened. The big problem is that the Morsi and the Muslim Brothers, I think they started dealing with El-Sisi as if he was just another member of the guidance office of the Muslim Brothers. So they make decisions in the guidance office and they just inform El-Sisi and inform the state. In Sinai, Some foreigners were kidnapped in Sinai a few months ago. And the view of the army was this required a military operation, a security operation to release them. The Muslim Brothers objected, Morsi objected, and he instead negotiated with the kidnappers and released those who were kidnapped, and in exchange released also some of the people who were held from Sinai.
So you're saying that the military feared increasing unrest in Sinai and felt the Brotherhood was not going to be on top of that?
The military feared a scenario where you have militants from Sinai firing rockets at Israel, and Israel wants to retaliate or actually retaliates, and then you have a government in Cairo saying, no, we cannot spill the blood of fellow Muslims, and then Egypt becomes something like Gaza. This is, from the perspective of the military, this is serious. This has nothing to do with democracy or military. This is their understanding of national security. And I think nothing could have turned Sisi against the Muslim Brothers more than this. Let me tell you one thing else. I read a paper that was written by Sisi when he was attending a war college in the United States in 2006. And you'd be surprised what he wrote in this paper. He was saying that corrupt regimes in the Middle East can only be transitioned into democracy if the United States allows a moderate Islamist force to rule. You would think that the guy is a member of the Muslim Brothers. We have to think what would turn somebody like that. It is something that has to do with Egyptian national security. We don't have all the information, but we have to think about it.
I want to take a look at foreign reaction, including from the US, and we have a short film about that. Let's take a look.
Since President Mohamed Morsi was deposed in early July, thousands of Muslim Brotherhood supporters have taken to the streets. The mood has been increasingly tense. Attempts by Western diplomats to help resolve the crisis offered little in the way of concrete advice.
Only an inclusive process will work, and though I recognize that is challenging, it is really important to begin now.
The U.S. response to Morsi's ouster has been unclear. Washington has talked about cutting aid to Egypt and urged the release of political prisoners as a step towards reconciliation. But there's been little action.
In a democracy, you have to sit down and talk with each other, even though you may not like the person on the other side of the table. It is impossible to talk with somebody who's in jail.
Top Egyptian officials have complained of international interference in the political process. They say reconciliation is a priority, but only after the Muslim Brotherhood renounces violence. The question for foreign governments is, what can they do to help?
And let's try to answer that question. Jan Kuhlmann, we've seen a parade of international diplomats heading to Cairo ever since the military took over on July 3rd, all of them leaving then in futility, having achieved basically nothing. What kind of leverage do foreign governments have? What do they need to be doing right now, aside from saying, expressing their distress?
I think that in general the international community is pretty powerless right now. We've seen this. We've had a lot of envoys coming from all over the world to Egypt trying to find any kind of political solution for the crisis, but the country is so deeply polarized that even they couldn't do anything, and they just had to leave without having done their job. And I don't think that the situation has changed. The only country who has some power is the United States. They give a lot of money, more than 1 billion, 1.3 billion US dollar every year they give to the military. So they have some kind of leverage, but in the end it's just an inner Egyptian thing which has to be solved in Egypt. And I think that in the end the international community has to be very careful with what they are doing, because the Egyptians are very sensitive about any kind of foreign intervention.
The U.S. has explicitly refrained from calling the military takeover a coup, because that could lead to a legislative necessity to freeze the aid to Egypt. Should that happen? Should they now say this was a coup and we are freezing that aid?
it was a coup. I don't know if it really helps the situation if the US now say it was a coup and
but freezing the aid as a lever, would that?
I don't think that it's so easy. I mean, if you freeze the aid, what is the military going to do? I mean, it's not that they will change. In the end, they will say, okay, then we don't get the money from the States, but we get the money from any other country.
And in fact, Samir, they did get aid in the last 5 weeks from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the Emirates. What needs to happen?
I think talking about the American aid to Egypt as a favor and stopping it, if it will help or not, is misleading. Americans are doing what's the right thing for them, is taking care of their advantages. And they have taken this stance by not declaring it a coup because they have learned that it is not to the American advantage to put too much pressure and stopping this aid. And that's why we have to be a bit realistic here. The international politics is not about democracy and is not about fairness. The American aggression on Iraq was illegitimate and still passed away because they had power. And that's why I think we have to really look at the issue from within the Egyptian society and its exceptional situation now. And the Muslim Brotherhood, they had a golden chance, not the military. I personally was a big supporter of Morsi in the first 3 months. And I just noticed, I said they deserved to have a chance to rule. They deserve to prove themselves. But what happened after 3 months? Step by step, I was convinced that they have an agenda that have nothing to do with their promises, and they are not going the right way to democracy.
Okay, but let's stay now with the question of implications for the region and what outside countries might be able to do to influence what we refer to as a process.
I have one thing small to add. I also disagree that the international community can do nothing now. Actually, the international community can put pressure on the current government in Egypt to stick to their promises that they will move forward with elections, and these elections will be transparent and will have full observation from the international community. This is essential.
But as we just said, this parade of international diplomats trying to put that pressure wasn't very successful in the past 5 or 6 weeks. Ahmed Badawi, who has leverage? What could it actually do?
I agree with both. The international community cannot be overreaching now. I mean, there's really very little they can do. But what they can do is, exactly as Said said, just to make sure that somebody is watching. As I said, we are stuck between two authoritarian forces, whether it's the Muslim Brothers or the military. We have to make sure that the struggle between these two forces does not destroy the whole country. Elections are important, maybe not too soon. There needs to be some time for healing. We need to see what the Muslim Brothers are going to do. I'm still hoping. We cannot imagine politics in Egypt without the Muslim Brothers. I mean, we can all agree on that. But not the Muslim Brothers which exist now. There is so much tradition. They have so much tradition. They can go back to the pure thinking, the good thinking of Hassan al-Banna, and get rid of the thinking of Sayyid Qutb. And these conversations have been going on inside the Muslim Brothers for the last 10 years. Now I think is the time for some rational, intelligent people from inside the group to get together and come back to politics, and then we can do elections.
Are there democracy-building measures that could also be taken by outside countries to help bring that along?
Please, let's leave all democracy-building measures out of this. They have been part of the problem. I don't think they can be part of the solution, and that maybe can be the subject of another show.
Jan Kuhlmann, what other countries? We talk always about the U.S. as having leverage. Turkey's prime minister just said the Arab League needs to be doing something here. He also called on the UN Security Council to take action. Anything either of those bodies could do?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think that any kind of these foreign forces, may it be the Arab League or the United Nations, that they really have any kind, that they really can put any kind of pressure on the government or on the military. This probably would be to no avail. What they might do is that they try to be in the middle of the two groups, and that they try negotiate something like a discourse between the two groups. Perhaps there are some people in the middle in Egypt who are in between the two big groups, people like Ahmed Badawi or Abdelmonem Abul Futuh, a former Muslim brother. Perhaps they can support these kind of people. What you really need, these two big groups, they have to start to talk again. They have to start to talk again, and they have to find a way to compromise in a peaceful way. This is the only chance Egypt has if it really wants to have a peaceful solution for the whole problem.
So, Samir, you talked about the U.S.'s actual interests as opposed to perhaps their lip service that's paid to goals like democracy. The fact is their main interest is to see Egypt be stable. They are terribly, terribly concerned that Egypt could dissolve into something resembling Syria. To what extent is that fear justified? And do you think that Egypt could become an attractive point for jihadists? Could we see the same kind of streaming of jihadists into Egypt that we have seen, for example, in regard to Syria?
No, I don't think so. I think the situation in Egypt is different because the state is still strong and they are not really classified according to religion or to one school of thought, even politically. And the thing about stability, I'm sure this is the interest of American government in Egypt, and it is very legitimate, and they were trying to support Muslim Brotherhood because they were thinking they will be able to supply this, and they stopped supporting the Muslim Brotherhood exactly when they learned that they are not helping this cause. And it was the same thing what happened with Mubarak. They were supporting Mubarak at the beginning until they realized he has no chance to stay. And back to the question of the situation and the possible solution inside the Muslim Brotherhood, I know personally leaderships that have been pushed down by others because they were rational and because they don't have this extreme, unrealistic wish of controlling power, not only in Egypt. And this is the huge threat, not only for Egypt, for the whole region, and maybe for the world. They do believe that they can build an empire that will invade the whole world and control everything. This is not just talks. This is a deep belief in the minds of leaders inside field Islamic groups.
I think we have to be a bit careful with just demonizing the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, this is just let me say some things about it. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood is a very big organization, and you have many different groups within the Muslim Brotherhood. As you have said, you have different...
He was talking about a particular faction inside the Muslim
Exactly what I was saying. Yes. So you don't disagree to agree with me.
Well, I disagree in some respects. I think we have also had something like a democratic discourse within the Muslim Brotherhood in the last 10 or 20 years. And there's no question about it that Morsi's government really has failed. And in the end, it was his own fault that he failed, because he really was a bad politician. And the problem is that in general, the Muslim Brotherhood has had a more formalistic understanding of democracy. So they thought, okay, we win elections. I think that they really are in favor of free elections, and the elections were free. But they thought, once we win election, we can do whatever we want. So we have to be... I think that these factions within the Muslim Brotherhood, who are rather for democracy, now are in a very bad situation, because the other ones can argue, see what happens if you stick to democracy.
Ahmed Badawi, it was sometimes said that the military had actually worked behind the scenes to sabotage the Muslim Brotherhood economically, that, for instance, products suddenly became scarce, and so on. To what degree would you say that economic misery in Egypt, and of course now we've seen tourism fall even further, that economic misery will further destabilize the situation? What can Egypt do to get its economy back up?
That's another thing where the international community also can help. What Egypt needs to do to get the economy up and running, you need to have stability first. You cannot have economic growth, you cannot have normal economic activity without political stability. So that's the big challenge now. But next to this, you can also start injecting some resources into the economy just to try to make ends meet for the people. The Egyptian economy is very heavily subsidized. These subsidies, I don't imagine a scenario where any government will imagine removing these subsidies now, for example. So in negotiations, if they decide to go again to negotiations with the IMF, these political considerations need to be kept in mind, and this is something where Western governments can help. So these resources that should be injected into the economy now, just to provide for the people, for the short term, until some movement happens on the political level, I think this is very important for the short term. Long term, the Egyptian economy is structurally very problematic. So to change, transform the economy, that is a very long-term thing, but you cannot start it without having political stability.
And fight corruption is also a very important measure.
Sorry, which option?
Corruption. Fighting corruption. Yeah. This is
But from what Ahmed has just told us, we have a vicious circle there. If political stability is necessary for economic improvement, and economic improvement is necessary in order to stabilize the situation politically, then it's a vicious cycle.
Not really, because you have different types of political stability. Now is the time of a real crisis. It's almost a war. It is not a war, and I hope it's not going to be a war. And if you go over this, if you can deal with this, as I was saying, by trying to use some moderate players to mediate between the two authorities, this can go out, and in the end, I think in the long run, economic stability can be reached.
Jan Kuhlmann, very briefly, if you would please, optimistic or pessimistic scenario looking at, say, 6 months from now?
At the moment, I'm rather pessimistic.
Ahmed Badawi?
Short-term pessimistic, long-term optimistic. Yeah.
The same with him, short-term pessimistic, yeah, long-term optimistic.
Okay, thank you very much to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.